what brought us to having a psycho rapist, 34 conviction criminal in the White House? And how did this happen? And there's a lot of possible starting points, but the one that I think is probably the most informative is 1951. In 1951, a fellow by the name of Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot, was the title of the book. And it's, to this day, the Bible of the conservative movement. You'll hear, conservatives, Republicans in particular, talk about Russell Kirk all the time. And at the time, Kirk was thought of as kind of like a Curtis Yarvin, kind of like this weird intellectual who's just out there and nobody takes him all that seriously, or at least Curtis Yarvin a year ago. His book, From Burke to Eliot, Edmund Burke, of course, was the British philosopher, economist, conservative, who famously said back during the American Revolutionary time, actually around the time of the French Revolution, said, it does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in as servile a profession as a tallow maker, candle maker, or hairdresser, but it does society considerable violence if such a person is allowed to participate in governance, in other words, to vote. So that was kind of the starting point, and then T.S. Eliot was the more contemporary end on Kirk's book. But basically what Kirk was arguing was that you have to have, in order to have a functioning society, you have to have classes and orders. That's a natural thing, that there's this natural order to societies, and a caste system is a desirable thing. And and like I said, basically nobody took him seriously. His argument was that there were 4 or 5 major threats to the future functionality of America. That there was the threat that if the middle class, now keep in mind, when Franklin Roosevelt came into office in 1932, or 33, in March of 33, only about 10% of America was in the middle class. When Reagan came in 81, it was 66%. We're down to 47% now as a result of 44 years of Reaganism, but it was, in 1951, it was approaching 50%. And so one of Kirk's first arguments was if the middle class ever got too large, that would lead to the destruction of our society. Because you've got to have classes and orders, and you've got to have a large class of basically the working poor in order to keep society going, grinding along. He was also very opposed to unions. His second argument was that if women ever, now keep in mind this is 1951, in 1951, women couldn't sign a mortgage, they couldn't get a credit card, there was no-fault divorce, et cetera, so you couldn't get an abortion. You couldn't even get birth control. In fact, well, anyway. So he said if women ever have equal power with men, that will be another thing that will lead to the end of American society. He said if the young people ever cease to respect their elders, that will be the end of society. And he said if minorities, racial minorities specifically, ever acquire power equal to that of white people in this society, that'll be the destruction of our society. So these were the primary arguments that Russell Kirk was making in 1951. And really the only 2 people who took him seriously were Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley. And Buckley writing in his famous 1954 article about how the white race is the superior race and all this kind of stuff, basically endorsing Russell Kirk. And then came the 60s. And when the 60s happened, we were flat on in the middle of the civil rights movement. The birth control pill was legalized in 1961, so by 1965, by the mid-1960s, you had a women's rights movement, that was just going full tilt boogie. You had the Vietnam War, so you had young people who were, young men burning their draft cards and protesting in the streets. And you had a substantial union movement that had taken us from the less than 50% middle class to the more than 60% middle class that Reagan inherited and then tried to destroy. And at that point, as the streets were, Kent State was happening and Bloody Sunday was happening and the Edmund Pettus Bridge was happening and all this stuff was going on, At that point, in the mid-1960s, particularly post 64, 65, post, like by 66, 67, 68, after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were passed, a lot of Republicans suddenly became converts to Russell Kirk, and just adopted this belief that these were all bad things, that this was not societal evolution, that these were not positive trends in society, that these were the things that were going to just absolutely and utterly destroy America. And so what came out of this was what we generally refer to as the Reagan Revolution, where Reagan came in. Well, let me back up a little bit. In 1971, Lewis Powell, who was a tobacco lawyer in Virginia, wrote this memo saying that, and he was citing Russell Kirk also, saying that, conservatives need to take control of the universities, they need to take control of the courts, they need to take control of the media, they need to take control of government, they need to take, basically every, sort of the 1960s version of the Seven Mountain Mandate, all these aspects of society that conservatives needed to just grab hold of and own and control. And this memo so impressed Richard Nixon that the next year, 72, he put Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court. 4 years later, in 1976, Lewis Powell was one of the, it was a 5-4 decision, one of the votes for a Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Vallejo. William F. Buckley's brother, it was a very wealthy family. He was running for the Senate from New York, and he had a lot of money, and he wanted to be able to spend it on his own campaign. At that time, there were these campaign finance laws that said you can't do that. And so he sued, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in 76 in Buckley versus Vallejo that a wealthy person can finance their own campaign because money is the same thing as speech in the political context, because money can be used to purchase advertising on television or on radio or whatever, and therefore money is speech. Speech is protected by the First Amendment, political speech in particular, and therefore unlimited money basically coming from the candidates themselves. This was the beginning, 76 was the beginning of the time. At that point in time, a very small minority of people in the House of Representatives were wealthy. And there were more rich people in the Senate, but not like today, nothing like today. And this is when the Republican Party started actively recruiting rich people to run for political office because they could finance their own campaigns. 2 years later, in 1978, in a decision called First National Bank versus Bellotti, there was this law in Massachusetts that said that a corporation could not put money into a political campaign unless that campaign had to do with the business of that corporation. They could speak up on their own behalf. If somebody was trying to pass a law about banking, a bank could lobby against it, but not if it had nothing to do with banking. And there was this initiative in Massachusetts that had to do with abortion, and the First National Bank of Boston was helping fund it. And so Frank Bellotti, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, sued the First National Bank. In this case, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti went to the Supreme Court, and Lewis Powell himself wrote the decision in 1978. Again, citing Russell Kirk and saying that, not only is money free speech, but corporations are also persons. Now, there's a predicate to that. I wrote a whole book about it called Unequal Protection that goes back to 1886 and the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case. But that had not really made its way into law the way that it did in 1976 with this law, or with this Supreme Court ruling. And so the consequence of this was that suddenly we shifted basically from democracy to oligarchy. And the real easy way to understand this is this contest that I've been running on my program for the 23 years I've been on the air, which is if you can name one piece of legislation since the Reagan Revolution. Now, this is not true of the Eisenhower presidency. He would be a Democrat today, in the 1950s. But if you can name one piece of legislation since Ronald Reagan's presidency that was written, and that was primarily authored by Republicans, that passed a Republican majority in the House and Senate, was signed into law by a Republican president, whose principal beneficiary is the average working person, you win the prize, right? And the prize is like an autographed book or something. You know? And nobody has ever won that prize, because there literally isn't one. I mean, you know, we went from passing all kinds of stuff that benefited average working people, right? I mean, you know, in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, when Dwight Eisenhower ran for re-election in 1956, his whole campaign pitch was that he had added, in the first 4 years of his presidency, he had added 4 million new people to the union rolls and multiple millions of people. He had expanded Social Security. I mean, you know, like I said, today he would be considered a Democrat. So you had, I mean, you know, starting in the 30s, we got the right to unionize, we got unemployment insurance, we got Social Security, you know, we got workplace safety standards, we got the 8-hour day, we got the 40-hour week, we got, you know, paid overtime. All those things took place in the 30s, and then, you know, and through the 40s. And then, you know, in the 1960s, of course, we got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and Medicare and Medicaid and all this stuff, all this incredible stuff that the Republicans like to call communism, that came out of Congress and presidents in that period from 1933, you know, with the New Deal, right up until 1981, when Reagan put a screeching halt to this thing with the Reagan Revolution. And so, since then, basically every piece of legislation that has been of any consequence at all has principally benefited rich people and giant corporations. And, you know, in '92, when Bill Clinton became, or was running for president, he faced a real problem as a result of these two Supreme Court decisions, because there was all this money that was pouring into the Republican Party as a result of the Buckley and Bellotti decisions. And, you know, he basically looked around and said, okay, how am I going to do this? How can I run against this? And obviously, you know, decided, well, you know, we're going to have to get in bed with the oligarchs too. And so that's why, you know, he invented this thing he called the Third Way, you know, the New Democrat Alliance and all this kind of stuff, which was basically just like, we're going to be Ronald Reagan light. And so, and that's why, I mean, you know, there were some good things that happened out of the Clinton presidency. I don't mean to totally diss Bill Clinton. The problem was the times. I mean, he really basically had no choice if he wanted to win that election as a result of these Supreme Court decisions. And that's why, you know, when Obama became president and he wanted to put in place a national health care system, he borrowed the template that had been written by Republicans at the Heritage Foundation. They're the ones who came up with Obamacare. That whole, the Affordable Care Act was originally written by the Heritage Foundation. It was one of their mandates for governing that went back to the Reagan era. Is, you know, just hand everything over to the big corporations, the big insurance companies, and, you know, and we'll take it from there. So basically for 44 years we've been living in this oligarchic state, and you know, with the conservatives having declared war on unions, having declared war on women's rights, having declared war on students. We've gone from having basically free college in the United States right up until the 80s. You know, it was free in California. It was inexpensive pretty much everywhere else. When I went to college in the late 60s, you know, I didn't graduate, but to the extent that I did go to college, I could pay for it along with my room and board. You know, washing dishes at Bob's Big Boy and pumping gas at the Esso station across the street on Trowbridge Road in East Lansing. So you could do that back then. Student debt was unknown. I mean, the only person I knew at that time who had any student debt was a guy who was working on his master's degree in econ. So, who's still an old friend. But so this is and now we have, you know, $1.5 trillion of student debt, which is just burdened, you know, 2 generations of Americans now. It's hard to start a business. It's hard to start a family. It's hard to buy a house. It's, you know, the student debt is just this massive, crushing burden. And we're the only developed country in the world that has done this, because we were the first among the OECD countries, the 34 Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, the 34 richest countries in the world. And by the way, that goes all the way down to Costa Rica, which is the least populous and wealthy of the 34 countries. Just an anecdote. We had a family vacation that my sister-in-law organized about 5 years ago in Costa Rica. She rented a house and invited myself and my brothers and their families down there. And Louise and I flew into this, I forget the town in Costa Rica, and the house that Connie had rented was about an hour's drive, maybe a 40-minute drive away. And so we grabbed a cab at the airport, and the cab driver was telling us as we were driving out there, telling us how his son had just graduated from medical school. And we're like, whoa, that's really cool. How'd you do that on a cab driver's salary? And he's like, oh, medical school is free here. All college is free here. And he says, by the way, medicine is free here too. It's like, we have a national health care system and we have free college. We don't have an army, but life is good. So anyhow, we're the only country in the OECD that has student debt. We're literally the only one where student debt is a thing. I mean, there are obviously, people who go into debt and they want to go to fancy schools and things like that. But as the norm, we're the only OECD country, the only one of these 34 developed countries, where medical debt breaks. Roughly 500,000 families a year have to declare bankruptcy because of medical debt. People lose their homes, they lose their families, they lose their jobs, they lose everything. 500,000 American families every year. The total number, if you add up all the other 34 OECD countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Germany, France, Italy, just go all the way down to Costa Rica, the total is 0. Just here. Again, why? Because oligarchy. Because we ceased to be a functioning democratic republic and we started to become an oligarchy. Jimmy Carter was on my radio program about 8 or 9 years ago. And I asked him what he thought about Citizens United. In fact, it was the year after Citizens United. It must have been 2011. And he said, and this clip lives on in the internet. It's real easy to Google. He said, America's no longer a democracy. We're now an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery as a result of these Supreme Court decisions. Buckley, Bellotti, and then Citizens United, and then McCutcheon after that. So here we are. Living in an oligarchy. Well, that's a bit of a problem because the thing about oligarchy is that oligarchy is almost always a transitional form of government. It's very rarely a stable form of government. In fact, I can't think of a single example where oligarchy is a stable form of government. And the reason why is because when the rich people start grabbing everything and the poor people are getting screwed 16 ways to Sunday and they know it, they tend to rise up. And then one of two things happens. Either the people in power stomp on them, squash them like a bug, and then your oligarchy has become autocracy, or the people who rise up successfully overthrow the oligarchy and you go back to being a democracy, which, by the way, is what happened in 1933. We were moving aggressively in the direction of oligarchy throughout the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties sounds like a wonderful time. The standard of living of average working people actually went down during the Roaring Twenties. What was roaring about it was rich people were getting insanely rich. And, so some social scientists, I'm forgetting the name of the guy, but he wrote a book about this, have discovered that basically there's only 4 ways to end oligarchy. Plague. That's what ended oligarchy in the 13th and 15th centuries and led to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Plague literally broke the oligarchy. Revolution. That's what we had here in 1776. We had a massive economic crash in 1771, followed by the American Revolution, and we broke the British oligarchy or the British-controlled oligarchy here. Plague, revolution. Let me check my notes here. Oh yeah, massive economic collapse, which is what happened in the 1930s. That was the example I just gave you. And massive war that destroys enough infrastructure of a country that it breaks the oligarchy itself. This is what happened to Japan and Germany, to the oligarchies of Japan and Germany in the 1930s, in the 1940s. So basically it's these 4 ways that oligarchy gets broken. And my concern is that we're far enough down this oligarchy road that it's not going to change just because of an election. I mean, we can do our best, right? And we have to. We have no choice. We have to. We have to get everybody we know registered to vote. We need to push back on everything, all this gerrymandering and all this other stuff that's going on. But basically, those four things are all like in extremis, right? They're all sufficiently violent to shake society enough that the oligarchs lose their grip on wealth and power, and then that wealth and power gets redistributed back down to the average people. We have been here before in America. In 1798, Eli Whitney invented this machine called the cotton gin. And the most time-consuming part of processing cotton, or the whole cotton production process, is picking the seeds out. These seeds are real sticky, and the little cotton fibers stick into them. They grow right through the seeds, and so what the cotton gin did is it was a big drum with like screen on it, and then it had these things with these little hooks that reached in and pulled the cotton fibers out and left behind the seeds. And you'd hook it up to a horse walking in a circle, turning the thing, and that one machine could do the work of 50 enslaved people. And so what happened in the South, and Whitney got an investor in the early 1800s, like around 1804, 1805. And by 1815, he was aggressively marketing the cotton gin in the South. But it was a very expensive machine. And the only people who could afford to buy it were the very large plantations. And so what happened during this period of time from 1815 till around 1830 is that these very large plantations were they were 50 times more efficient than the small cotton operations. And so they just wiped them out. And during that period of time, the South ceased to be anything resembling a functioning democracy, because about 1,000 families in the southern states, what became the Confederate States, about 1,000 families basically seized first economic control of the South, created an oligarchy, and then seized political control of the South and created tyranny, basically. Democracy ended. By 1845, there was no democracy in the South. Every opposition newspaper had been shut down. Every anti-slavery newspaper had been shut down. But not just the abolition movement. If you stood up to these oligarchs in any way, even if you were a white man, you would get lynched. People were imprisoned. You know, they would read your vote, and if you voted the wrong way, you could get beat up or have your house caught on fire. So we had a full-blown oligarchic tyranny in the southern states by 1850, full on. And then they started looking at the North going, this is a bad example we got up here, this democracy that's going on. And we're going to take it down. We're going to turn the whole North American continent into a damn oligarchy. And of course 700,000 people died in that war. And, but the point is that we have been here before. And sadly, they don't teach this history in schools. In fact, I was telling Michael before when we moved to Atlanta back in 1982, I think it was. And my son was 7 or 8 years old, and one night we were having dinner, and I said, you know, he was in the local public school in Atlanta, and I said, or suburban Atlanta, was Marietta. Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. And I said, you know, what did you learn in school today? And he says, oh, today we studied the War on Northern Aggression. So, I mean, granted, that was 30 years ago, but I suspect they're still doing it, you know. And there's this interesting theory about every 80 years. Those of you who listen to the program a lot know I've talked about this before. Howe and Strauss and Howe wrote this book called The Fourth Turning. And they suggested that basically every 80 years there is this kind of reboot that happens in the United States. And it follows a particular pattern, that there is an economic crash. That economic crash is followed by a war. That war is then followed by basically a progressive rebooting of society. And so in 1771, we had the Great Crash. That was followed by the American Revolutionary War. 80 years after that, you had the Great Crash of 1856, followed by the Civil War. 80 years after that, you had the Great Crash of 1929, followed by the Second World War. And 80 years ago this year, World War II ended.